Oh my god. Could this video be any more about Friends? I know. Hello everyone, I'm Sarah from Everyday Starlet. Welcome to my channel. I make videos to inspire you to be the star of your own life. Today I want to talk about the masculine feminine energies in the classic sitcom Friends. If you're new to my content and you're not familiar with what I mean by masculine and feminine energies, I have a ton of videos about this topic, but a brief summary: masculine and feminine energies are energies that live within all of us. We all contain both energies, but we all have a core energy. This is when we're most ourselves in. That energy often links up with our gender. It doesn't have to, but it very often does. So most women are going to be feminine at their core and most men are going to be masculine at their core. And the ideal way to have a balance in your energies is to primarily be in your natural core energy most of the time, because that's when you're going to be at your best. But you also want to have access to a healthy version of the opposite energy that you can tap into whenever you need to. But both men and women can be in wounded or healed versions of either of these energies, either masculine or feminine. And in order to have sexual polarity in a relationship, you need one partner to be in the masculine and one partner to be in the feminine, because opposite energies attract sexually and same energies repel sexually. So I wanted to do a character analysis of the main characters on the show Friends. This was actually a requested video, and if you missed the video where I talked about this, I won't be able to do individual scene breakdowns, at least not as of right now, because I ran into some copyright issues, particularly on TikTok. I am growing my new TikTok account, trying not to use copyrighted material, even though what I was using before was all fair use, but it became a big drama, and I'm growing my TikTok account. Link is in the description box below if you'd like to check that out. So I wasn't sure if I was going to be doing these like film and TV show breakdowns anymore, because I can't do individual scene breakdowns. However, I do think really popular shows like Friends that are really based more on characters as opposed to individual scenes can be helpful to people to understand masculine and feminine energies and dynamics. So I kind of wanted to do this breakdown anyway, and since this is getting to be holiday time and Friends was so iconic for its Thanksgiving episodes, that I thought this was the time of year that I should do it. So I rewatched the series, although I've seen it, I saw it when it originally came out, I've seen it a bunch of times, but I rewatched the series and just finished it yesterday actually. Now before I get into the character analysis, I want to make a note that, as I mentioned in other TV show breakdowns I've done, like Sex and the City and Golden Girls, shows like that, when sitcoms are on TV for a significant amount of time, they have different directors, they have different writers, and while you know, they're really supposed to keep the characters pretty consistent throughout the show, there may be individual scenes in the course of, you know, a long-running series that might contradict some of the things that I say. And plus also sitcoms especially are really designed to like go for the joke, to go for the laugh. So there's gonna be individual scenes or lines or things that may not line up exactly with the general character analysis. But I really want to talk about these characters as they are, sort of as a whole, even though there might be some individual scenes that might contradict some of the things that I'm gonna say. I will say about Friends, which whether you like the show, whether you don't, the writing and the acting on the show is really solid. So even if you don't like the characters, even if you don't like the humor, the acting and the writing on the show is really solid and it's consistent. And it's interesting how so many shows, especially long-running shows, characters can really kind of go off the rails. They can kind of become caricatures of themselves. They really did an amazing job on the show of keeping the characters like depth and complexity throughout the series. Because Friends is considered one of the most popular sitcoms, if not the most popular sitcom of all time, obviously it has a lot of fans and it also has a lot of critics. I'm not going to dive into all the reasons why people criticize Friends. If you love it or you hate it or you're neutral on it, that's really not the point of the video. This is really about a character analysis. But one of the things I did want to point out that is one of the criticisms that comes with Friends is that it is a representation of the breakdown of the family structure, that it is a show in reality about substituting your family with your friendships. And it's an interesting thing that I want to point out, because Friends in reality is very symbolic of a generation. It's a very Gen X show. It really represents the Generation X generation, particularly in its earlier seasons. The coffee shops, the acoustic guitar players, the angst, like that kind of stuff. And in reality, the world has shifted, and you do find more people who are Gen X and even millennials who have parents who are more of like the boomer generation, who have shifted their perspective in parenting. And that's the generation, so to speak, that grew up in the 60s. They're the generation that was very much, divorce existed before that, but that was the generation where divorce became very common. where parents really decided that they wanted a life away from their kids. They wanted a life outside of their kids and were like counting down the days until their kids were like out of the house and on their own so they could like live their life. I'm not saying that the younger generations haven't picked up on that to a certain extent, but it really was like the boomer generation that kind of started that trend. And if you notice on Friends, most of the characters on the show came from broken families or families that even if they were together, they were really not a solid family unit. This show was a representation of a generation of people that felt like their families had failed them and they decided to create their own family with their friendships. And you can say that it's right or wrong. However, it's a normal response to when your own like blood family has let you down or has fallen apart in some way. It's natural for you to want a community, and to make a community out of your friendships is a very normal thing. It's a very human thing. And I think like when I've talked about sitcoms, you know, that have like the dumb dad phenomenon, I think there's a lot of questions about like, is this art imitating life or life imitating art? Is it that like dads have gotten dumber, or is it that the dumb dads represented in the media have made it acceptable for dads to be seen as dumb or to not necessarily be like a smart leader of a family? And you could look at Friends in a similar way, is that, you know, is this type of family structure, as far as having a family that is actually your friendships, like is that art imitating life or is that life imitating art? Because in reality it was happening in the world. Did the show make it more common or more acceptable? Maybe, but I think we do know that this was something that has been happening, and the Gen X generation really was experiencing a lot of these things. If you look at just the parents in this situation, Chandler's family was very complex in the fact that he was a child of divorce. His mom was kind of like running around with a lot of different men. His dad was running around with a lot of different men. You had Rachel's family who was getting a divorce, and her parents were obviously not very happy. And I'll get into her and her mom and that kind of stuff a little bit later. Phoebe's family, you know, her mother had committed suicide, her father had run out, her stepdad was in jail. Like, she really came from a very broken home and had tried to survive on the streets. Joey's family, like, was a big Italian family, but he had so many sisters. We don't get a ton of information about his family specifically, but we do know that his father was having an affair, his mother was looking the other way. So there obviously was some drama going on in that family. And then of course there was Monica and Ross's parents, who we did see more throughout the show, and they were still together. But even when you're looking at like the very first Thanksgiving episode, the storyline is Monica and Ross's parents are gonna go off and go on a vacation with some of their friends for Thanksgiving, and they're not going to spend Thanksgiving with their kids. And so Monica decides to create this Thanksgiving so that they can all have Thanksgiving together, because they feel like they can't go home to their families for Thanksgiving. And I think that that is really representational of what was going on in that generation of people who felt so disconnected from their own family structure that they created their own family structure out of their friendships. Is that the ideal situation? That's debatable. However, finding a family and finding a community, whether it be your natural born family or whether it be the family that you've chosen, friendships, things like that, it's a normal thing. Like, it's a normal thing for people to go through. So I think to judge a show that represents a generation that was truly going through this stuff, I think is a little short-sighted, because you have to look at what was actually going on at that time period and what was that generation, the Generation X, actually going through. And in reality, you could say that that has continued. Now, did the show contribute to it continuing, or was that just the trend that was going on in the world at the time? I mean, you could debate that all day, but you know, again, it's the art imitating life or life imitating art question. Okay, so let's get into the characters on Friends. I'm gonna start with Monica. Monica has a very special place in my heart. She does. I really love Monica for several reasons. For one, Monica reminds me a lot of my mom. That like obsessive need to keep everything clean and organized and orderly and in control, and like that kind of like obsessive compulsive thing where like, oh, it's not clean, I have to clean it. It's very much my mom. I also identify a lot with Monica because in the discussions of Monica's childhood and her struggling with her weight and being overweight and how she dealt with it and how people treated her when she was overweight and things like that, was very much me. I was always the fat kid growing up. So Monica really does have a very special place in my heart. Monica is lovable she's also very screwed up, which you could probably say that about all these characters. A lot of these characters can be very lovable, but they're also very screwed up. Monica really is like the glue that holds the friendship group together. She really was like the mother hen. In fact, there is, even later on in the show, there's a comment that Chandler has about like, you know, he'll be a good dad someday, but like Monica's already a mom. And she really was. She was really like the mother of the group. And the fact that most of the stuff happened around her apartment. She was the one who entertained most of the time. She was the one that always had food for everybody. She really was like the sort of the center of this particular universe of the show. She was the one that cooked all the Thanksgiving dinners. She was the one that was in charge. She had the plan. The thing about Monica is that as lovable as she was very, very masculine. She's actually what I describe like a modern woman. It's interesting how when I hear people like sort of the podcast bros and stuff talk about like modern women or complain about modern women, they tend to represent them as like women who are, you know, doing OnlyFans or like shaking their butt online or being over sexualized for money. And I think that's really kind of ironic because in reality, I mean, yes, things like OnlyFans and stuff like that are very new as far as a trend in society. But women selling their bodies and exploiting their bodies for money or to get men or to get men's attention or to get something from men is the oldest profession that exists. So in reality, it's really just a modernized version of prostitution, which I would argue probably doing OnlyFans is much more pleasant than prostitution because you don't actually have to touch strange men. But when I think of like a modern woman, I think of somebody a little bit more like Monica and how Monica is as an adult on the show. Somebody who is so in her masculine because she's obsessed with perfection. She's obsessed with everything being perfect, everything being under her control, everything being orderly. She's incredibly competitive. Like she has this ego block where she cannot lose. Like she has to win everything. She's so competitive and she's so structured, organized, controlling, like that kind of thing. That's what I think of as a modern woman. Monica isn't necessarily somebody who wants to hurt people, so I wouldn't necessarily say she is in an extreme wounded masculine energy, but she definitely has wounding in her masculine in that her masculine has taken over the show. She's primarily in her masculine. And it's interesting because even though she really does have a lot of feminine desires of, you know, being a mother, having a family, nurturing and caring for people, it's still all in the name of structure and control. Like she wants these things because that's the path that she's on and that's her vision. She wants to be a bride and she wants to plan a wedding, but she wants to plan and organize this perfect wedding. Like everything is through a masculine lens and it's all through masculine structure and control. And she very much feels like a modern woman to me. Now, you do get a lot of glimpses into why Monica is like this because she grew up in a household where it is very obvious that her parents favored her older brother. Like it's not even subtle, like they're very, very obvious about it, which I'm sure was heightened for the show. But she really did grow up in her brother's shadow. Her parents put her brother up on a pedestal, and her mother especially constantly made Monica feel like she was not good enough. Her mother was always critical of her. They talk a lot about Monica being overweight when she was a kid. They do have a few flashback episodes where they put her in like a fat suit, and I find that ironic. It's a sign of the times of like the 90s and the early 2000s because Monica in a fat suit is not that big. I mean, she's significantly larger than Courtney Cox, but Courtney Cox is a very thin woman. So like Monica being the size that she is when she's in the fat suit in high school, I mean, I imagine they probably didn't want to make her too incredibly large because that would probably be less funny. It would be a little bit more like heart-tugging, like, oh my god, like if you really thought that this person, you know, their health was in danger or something, it would be more difficult to make it into a joke. So they had to make her big enough so they could make it into a joke, but not so big that it would be something that people would feel sorry for her. I mean, I do feel sorry for the way she's treated regardless, but again, it goes back to like that time period, and you can look at so many examples of that, of like women who were really not that big, who we were told were like so large, and looking back on it, you're like, they were really not that big, but we were programmed to think of people as being that big. But we were programmed into thinking that women who were just a little heavy were like gigantic. It is implied a lot throughout the series that the reason why Monica was eating so much and was so overweight was because she needed to fill herself with love, which is a very wounded feminine idea. That overeating, that kind of like over consuming anything really, but particularly food. For women in their wounded feminine, it's very common to overeat as a way to try to fill yourself up, to fill the emptiness within you. If you feel like there's something lacking in your life, very often lacking love, then overfilling yourself with food to give you that feeling of fullness is very common. It's a big sign of being in wounded feminine. There's a scene early on in the series when Phoebe is dating like a therapist, and Monica is like eating cookies and she's really depressed, and he says something to her about like, take it easy on those cookies, Monica, remember they're not love. It's kind of supposed to be something that like irritates her, but there's truth in that, right? Like there's a lot of truth in the fact that Monica did not feel loved. She didn't feel loved or appreciated. She never got any validation for anything that she did, so she overate to fill herself up, to feel that fullness, because it was comforting for her. In most of these characters, there's some holes in the story of things that just kind of probably wouldn't be true in real life, but you can kind of see where Monica, being so much in her wounded feminine when she was a kid, would then decide she was going to reject her feminine completely, because she associates her feminine with like not being good enough, with desiring love. And in order for her to lose the weight, which we never really find out how she lost the weight, but in order for her to lose the weight, she rejects everything that is her feminine and she steps fully into her masculine. So Monica really is using her masculine because she believes that that masculine energy is what gets her approval, which is actually very common. I mean, that's one of the main reasons that women are so much in their masculine nowadays, is because so many women have grown up, particularly I would say Generation X, millennials, have grown up with this attitude that being in your feminine is wrong, or it's unsafe, or it's not going to get you validation, it's not going to get you approval, it's not going to get you the things that you desire. You have to be in your masculine. So she has completely rejected her feminine because she was in wounded feminine and that was not working for her. So instead of shifting into a healthy feminine energy, she shifts completely into her masculine. So now she's in this competition because she needs the validation, she needs the hit of winning. It is kind of like transferring one addiction to another, and addiction is usually wounded feminine, so she's still got some wounded feminine there, because her addiction to that rush of winning all the time is also her wounded feminine coming out. However, her obsessive need for structure and control and to be perfect and to perfect herself is very much her masculine energy. It's not a healthy connection to her masculine energy because she's doing it out of this desperation. It's not coming from like a grounded, aligned place. The reality of a Monica, like somebody who had actually gone through what Monica's been through, there's no way, and they obviously aren't going to touch on it on the show because the show is trying to be, you know, more of a mainstream sitcom. There's no way that a real life Monica, like somebody who has her story in real life, would not be maintaining her weight without an eating disorder. There's no real life way, because if you notice several times in the series, Monica kind of goes on a little bit of a binge. She would do that a lot more often because she clearly has not healed from her issues that she had in childhood. So the fact that adult Monica on the show maintains a relatively normal weight, even though she occasionally has her slips and stuff, there's no way she would be able to do that without having an eating disorder. It's just not possible. Real life Monica, who had that kind of level of food issues when she was young and then transitioned into that like obsessive compulsive behavior as an adult, there's no way she would be able to maintain her weight and to deal with that, because she obviously has not done therapy, she obviously has not worked through things. There's just no way that real life Monica would ever not have an eating disorder. And that she would ever be able to maintain her weight and to be able to maintain herself at that small a size, especially with the fact that she worked with food all the time, the fact that she would talk about food in a very loving way, and she would make jokes about like, oh, I never let my fat girl eat or something like that. Eating disorders are super common with people that then get a obsessive need to control, an obsessive need to perfect, an obsessive need to get yourself smaller. Partly comes from a wounded feminine of actually like abusing yourself, and it also comes from a wounded masculine of an obsessive need for control. So when you have both of those that exist in a person, you're gonna get some kind of, most likely an eating disorder if you're talking about a woman. It can happen to men, but it's more common in women. It also isn't super realistic that Monica is with Chandler for part of the show. I'm gonna get to some of her relationships, but Chandler has made fun of Monica's weight in the past. Chandler still kind of makes some jokes about Monica's weight, and Monica seems very okay with, if she gets pregnant, her body's gonna change. She has to accept that. Like, she seems so okay with her body as an adult, and that's not something that, unless she had gone through a lot of work, especially when at that point in the show she had a partner who kind of liked to make jokes about it, there's really no way that she would have been able to handle that in the way that she did. Some of these things are just not realistic. I mean, a lot of the show and a lot of the characters and a lot of things are just not necessarily realistic to what you would see in everyday life. Her rejection of her feminine because it felt wrong, or it was something that she was shamed for, and then her obsession with her masculine, that's very common. Very, very common. And someone like Monica in real life is absolutely geared for burnout. Like, she's absolutely preparing herself for complete burnout. Now, Monica's two primary relationships on the show were Richard, played by Tom Selleck, and Chandler, who we'll get into his breakdown soon. Richard was actually Monica's dad's friend. So there was a big age gap there. And I'm not normally a fan or an advocate of like big age gap relationships, because I think very often when you get someone who is really young and someone who's much older, there's just so many red flags that tend to pop up in situations like that. However, it's interesting the way it is presented on the show, and I actually think that because Richard is such a grounded, mature adult man. Richard is very masculine. He's a very masculine man. Monica, who is so in her masculine, softens around Richard more than she does anybody else. Like, she really like softens and lets her guard down around him so much more. Now, I'm sure that some of this is daddy issues because she has never felt approval from her parents, but Richard is very different than Monica's dad, which is actually kind of surprising that they're friends. In fact, even when Monica's dad kind of finds out that Richard's dating a much younger woman, he gets very like childish about it, like very kind of like, you know, ooh, you got a young chippy in the city, and like he gets very like almost like a teenage boy. Whereas Richard stays very grounded. You kind of almost wonder like why those two would even be friends. Whereas Monica has a partner in Richard who is truly a mature, grounded adult, so she doesn't have to be in her masculine all the time. And it's funny how she's really self-conscious about kind of letting him see all of her neuroses and all of her obsessions and her obsessive compulsive behaviors and stuff like that. And as she kind of lets her guard down around him, because he's so loving and he's so accepting of who she is, I think that relationship was really healing for her. And I get why she maintained this sort of love for him throughout the entire series. Their big conflict was that Monica really wanted kids. She wanted kids, she wanted marriage and kids. Richard, who was older, already had kids. He had grandkids at that point, and he really didn't feel like he could be a dad again, which I respect. I love that they actually had Monica stand her ground and own what she wanted and not keep her in the relationship that ultimately wasn't going to give her what she wanted. Should Richard have had kids with her? I don't know. Is Richard the man that Monica should have been with? I really think she would have been much happier. She would have been able to let her guard down, and I think that their relationship would have been more solid. I don't love the age gap thing, and I think that the kid issue obviously would have been a problem. However, the fact that he was such a grounded masculine man, and if she had still been in a very wounded feminine state so that she was willing to let herself be abused by someone, I would say that that would be a signal that a big age gap relationship was bad, because typically when you have a woman who's very much in her wounded feminine, has got a lot of insecurity issues and stuff, which is common in younger women, an older man is likely going to prey on that. Whereas because Monica was so much in her masculine and she was so strong and she was so needing to be in control, like she had such strong masculine energy, having somebody who happened to be older but was just a very grounded masculine presence, who let her soften, who accepted her and loved her for who she was, which allowed her to like relax with him, I think is a good sign, because she wasn't necessarily somebody who was going into it letting herself being taken advantage of. She was going into it as a very strong woman, and because he had such a grounded presence, she was able to soften around him. I mean, again, they made the relationship complicated for the sake of the show, but like, is Richard the man that she probably should have been with? Probably. But now let's get into Chandler. Chandler, I relate to Chandler in some ways because he is an only child and he uses humor to deflect when he doesn't want to deal with his emotions. Chandler came from a really complicated home. He was a child of divorce. His mom was a romance novelist who was just basically sleeping with a bunch of men and fooling around. It was like very hypersexualized. And his dad was gay and was also sleeping around with a lot of men, was hypersexualized, and was in a gay cabaret show. But Chandler was definitely a man-child. He was absolutely the definition of a man-child. He was disconnected from his emotions and he used humor to deflect from his emotions. So he was not fully in his feminine energy, so to speak, but he definitely had not stepped into his masculine. It's not because he had a gay father, because you could argue that Joey and Ross, really like most men of that generation, were not stepping into their masculine, that did not have a very grounded masculine energy, and were really in this sort of arrested development, like they just were still little boys that had never grown up. And Joey had a dad, Ross had a dad, but Chandler really had not grown up. He had a very childlike way about him. He was very immature. He was very, very addicted to porn, which I want to make a note because I don't know if maybe because I'm much more aware of the dangers of pornography usage, and I've done a lot more research as to like how damaging it is, particularly for men in our society. It's rampant, and I've mentioned this in another video. The low number, like the low estimate, so it's probably higher, is that 76% of men are addicted to porn. The average age that a boy starts watching porn is about 11. So we literally have an entire generation, I mean, I would say for sure Gen X, probably older, but definitely younger than that, who have grown up and conditioned themselves to be addicted to porn. And all of these guys have it. Primarily Chandler and Joey, it's heavily emphasized with the two of them. I think because, I mean, I've seen this show so many times, but I guess maybe because I'm more aware of it and I'm paying attention to it more, this show really normalized porn usage. It was such a huge thread that ran throughout the entire series. And when something becomes so common that it becomes a joke in the biggest sitcom of all time, you know it's an incredibly normalized thing. And there's so many instances in the show where they kind of joke about the side effects of porn addiction. You know, at one point Chandler has like a pen that like if you turn it some way, he got it at like a bachelor party, if you turn it a certain way a woman's clothes fall off, then you turn another way her clothes are on, and then whatever. So he gets to make the woman take her clothes off with this pen, and he's playing with it, and at one point he says to one of the other characters like, hey, I'm getting bored with this, can you get me some porn? Because he's literally desensitized himself to seeing a naked woman, that he needs to heighten that, right? Which is classic addictive behavior. There's also an entire episode where Chandler and Joey are getting this free porn channel on their TV, because this was before internet porn was quite as common as it is today. I mean, it existed, but it wasn't as common because this was back in the 90s. And they were getting this free porn channel on their TV, and they couldn't turn it off. They became completely, like, that's all they did was just sit and watch this all the time. And they even kind of make a joke about the fact that, you know, they were starting to realize that women in everyday life were not acting like the women in porn because they were being conditioned. And I know that it's a joke for the show, but when something becomes so common that it becomes a joke on a mainstream sitcom that aired like in prime time on a major TV network, you know that that means that this is so deeply ingrained in our society. And the fact that I'd seen this show so many times, and then it wasn't until watching it now with my awareness of the dangers of porn usage that I even realized like how big a thread this was. I mean, it went throughout the entire show of like jokes about, you know, Monica finding Chandler with porn, or you know, Joey using porn and them finding him using it, or this and that. I mean, it was such a common thing. And someone like Chandler, who obviously had intimacy issues, he had commitment issues because he was terrified of human interactions, because what he had witnessed with his parents was essentially you know, people who their relationship had fallen apart. And in reality, to have a mother who was very hypersexualized and to have a father who was hypersexualized but who was gay and not interested in the mother, so you have two parents who are hypersexualized, but they're not hypersexualized to be attracted to each other, so they develop all this hatred and animosity towards each other, and they obviously had a pretty bitter divorce. Chandler, seeing that at a young age, really made him have no faith in intimacy, and no faith in commitment. He didn't have that as a model of knowing what true intimacy was, so he would substitute that with pornography usage, and it would really condition him to see sex as totally separate from intimacy. He even makes a comment at one point when he's with Monica, I think it is, that, you know, he always used to, you know, sleep with a woman and then want to hurry up and go talk to his friends or go hang out with his friends. But when he slept with Monica, he was already with a friend, which is beautiful for the show. In reality, it would be very hard for Chandler to make that leap, even with someone like Monica, who he truly was friends with and truly loved. And it also would be very difficult for any of those guys, really, with that level of porn usage and that level of disconnecting sex from intimacy. And porn usage absolutely conditions men to objectify women. The idea that those guys had Monica, Rachel, and Phoebe as such close friends that were women, in real life, that probably wouldn't happen, because these guys were all so screwed up and messed up from all that porn usage. There's so many negatives. I know people love to come and argue with me that it's not that big a deal. It is absolutely a big deal. I used to think that way too. I used to think like, oh, it's no big deal. Every guy watches it, whatever. The more I've learned about it, the more I realize how damaging it is for everybody, but particularly for men, because men are more likely to be addicted to it. It is so damaging, and the fact that this show really normalized it or helped normalize it is just really, it was just really eye-opening to watch the show now with the knowledge that I have. But Chandler is your classic man-child, and it's not that surprising that somebody like him, who is a man-child, would partner with someone like Monica, who is much more of a controlling, mothering kind of person. It makes sense. And they do have moments where Chandler steps into a much more grounded, mature energy, and Monica gets to kind of like lose it and soften. So there are for sure moments in their relationship when they're kind of able to shift into those energies. Honestly, I feel like Monica and Chandler are going to be Claire and Phil from Modern Family. It's going to be Chandler being goofy and silly, and it's going to be Monica having to kind of constantly be like the nag, or, you know, she's going to be called shrill or things like that. Like, I feel like that's especially once they have kids, which, you know, they end up adopting twins in the final episode of the show, so we don't really know where their relationship goes, but chances are it's most likely that that's where they're headed. They're headed for Chandler being like another child that Monica has to raise, and Monica having to be a mother to everyone in her family. On the show, Monica seems to handle this masculine energy quite well, but in real life, eventually that's going to burn her out. One of the things too with Chandler, and the fact that he still stayed a child, he hasn't stepped into his masculine yet, is Chandler's actually the only character on the show that doesn't have a true passion and purpose, which in order to step into your masculine energy, you really do need a passion and purpose. You need something greater than yourself, something that you're striving for, something that is your like reason for being here. And the running joke that nobody knows what Chandler's job is, and that Chandler doesn't like his job and things like that, he does end up finding advertising, which is something that he's much more passionate about later on in the show. And I think you do see, once he starts doing that, although that doesn't become a focus of the show, that he does tend to become more grounded. So I do think that there is a bit of a shift for Chandler as the show goes on. That is something that's very common though in men that are just kind of doing a job that they aren't passionate about. They're just showing up, earning a paycheck, and coming home, is that they're probably not fully stepped into their masculine energy. They're usually going to be the ones that aren't ready to settle down in relationships, because they're just kind of going through the motions, and they're gonna kind of tune out and zone out with things like pornography and things like that, because that's gonna be their stimulation, because they're not passionate about something in their life. Whereas you do notice when he did get into advertising that he did have more of a shift in focus as far as, you know, being ready to have a family and things like that. However, Chandler's always been somebody who's more erratic and unstable, so long term, is advertising going to be the thing that Chandler does forever, and is that going to stay something he's passionate about, or is he going to get bored with that and move on to something else? I mean, who knows? The show ended, so we don't really know where the character went, but in real life, somebody who is as lost as Chandler as far as his passion and purpose and that fearful of intimacy is probably not going to settle down. He might when he gets to a certain age, because he'll feel the pressure from society, and usually will settle down with someone like a Monica, who tends to be more of a mother figure, because that's really what he needs. Because again, like, Monica felt like she never had the approval from her parents, and Chandler felt like he didn't really have like a true mom and dad, so he's gonna be more drawn to someone who like is a mother because he didn't have that. And Monica is going to, because she's in that sort of mothering, controlling energy, is gonna tend to pair with somebody who's more immature and more man-child-like, which is why I always really felt like her and Richard would have been so much better, because he would have been that grounded presence. Chandler was improving, especially towards the end of the show, with finding a career that he was passionate about and things like that, but Chandler had a long way to go as far as maturity levels go. His on-again, off-again relationship with Janice too. I mean, Janice was a fun character. I always loved when she showed up, but if you notice that when Janice kind of like came to Chandler and was trying to be open and vulnerable with Chandler, he would run away, but then when she would get really kind of like cold and standoffish, that's when Chandler would kind of try to get to her, or when she was unavailable, because he was afraid of intimacy, so it was easier for Chandler to go after somebody when they were cold and distant, because it was safer for him. Whereas the minute that somebody wanted true intimacy with him, he had to run away, because he was afraid of having an intimate relationship with someone. It was a running joke that Chandler would always come up with something wrong with a woman. He would obsess over a person's flaws. That's very common when you're dealing with a more immature person, especially a person who's addicted to porn, because in porn, you don't get anybody's flaws. You only get the person for the purpose of what you want. You get this sort of like perfected idea of this like sexual experience, which isn't true intimacy, and you don't have to deal with any of the stuff that isn't just there for sex, which is why guys who tend to be addicted to porn expect women to be perfect versions, whether it be surgically altered perfection, so they can't handle a woman that may have like a pimple or something, because like in porn, it's a fantasy world, it doesn't exist, right? A woman is only there to be an object for his lust, so she has to be perfect. He doesn't have to deal with a woman when she is in her emotions or she's going through highs and lows. He only has a woman for the sake of the sexual pleasure. She's just an object for that. And men who have that porn addiction very often will get obsessed with any kind of slight potential flaw in a woman, which may not even necessarily be a flaw. It may just be a sign that she's human. And that's not to say that if something really is a red flag in a person, then obviously that's a different situation. But if you get obsessed over a person for having simply just a human quality about them, and you're expecting someone to be perfect, that's usually a sign that you have that kind of porn usage. It's a little bit different than Monica's perfectionism when it comes to her masculine energy, but a man who is masculine at his core, which I think Chandler is, but he just has not learned to step into his masculine from his like childlike state, and he's addicted to porn, he's going to expect someone to be perfect because he's conditioned to see a woman as simply just an object for his lust type of thing. Of course, there's always these kind of like weird implications with Chandler and Joey that they might be gay, and they joke about Chandler being possibly gay all the time. I know is a joke for the show. I don't really think that Chandler in real life is actually gay, but it's just he's so childlike, like he has not grown into his full masculine. Now Joey hasn't either, but because Joey is more of a womanizer, it's less implied that he's gay. But they make these jokes about, you know, Joey and Chandler and how they hug all the time and they're such close friends. And I mean, I think that was kind of the sign of the times, and I think that's changing a little bit. But one of the downsides, I think, of shows like this that imply that any kind of like men hugging or having like an emotionally intimate relationship, you know, with a friendship, like having a brotherhood, something like that, when that gets labeled as being gay, now if the men are gay, cool. But I think the implication that that can only exist in gay relationships between two men and that it has to become a sexual thing, I think actually hurts our society in general. Because, I mean, women can have emotional intimacy, they can actually have physical contact with each other, and it's it's not assumed that the women are gay if they have that connection. And I think it's important that men have a brotherhood as well, as much as women need to have a sisterhood. I think there are a lot of men who avoid having like a close friendship or brotherhood with another man because they don't want it to be seen as being gay, because they're not actually gay. I think if men are avoiding contact with each other or interactions with each other because they don't want to be deemed as gay because they're simply not gay, I think that's a problem we have in our society. Because I really do think that like brotherhood and male mentors and male leadership and communities of men that can actually support each other and call each other out on bad behavior is something that's really missing in our society. And it's not a gay or straight thing, but I think when we kind of like label it as being gay and imply that that's the only reason why men would actually have a close bond, I think it's a disservice to men in general. But it is interesting because Joey has a lot of the same qualities as Chandler, which is one of the reasons why they're such good friends. However, because he is more of a womanizer, he's better with women and he sleeps around a lot more, and he's kind of more of like the, you know, the good-looking, charming guy, he doesn't automatically get that label as being gay. But he is still very childlike. He is very naive and mature. He just has an easier time talking to women. Partly because, you know, he grew up with, I think it was 7 sisters. I forget how many sisters he had. But he grew up around women, so he was around women more. His parents were together. You find out that his dad was having an affair, so his dad's obviously a womanizer as well. You know, he was raised by, you know, a mom and a grandma, like that gets mentioned in the show and stuff. Joey's just more comfortable around women than Chandler is. Chandler being in a situation, if you think about it, having a dad who is kind of rejecting being a man. I know that's probably controversial, but kind of always dressing as a woman. You could see where Chandler would have a hard time figuring out how to step into his masculine energy. It just came to me. But with Joey, having his dad as a representation of masculine and being a man, but his dad obviously being somebody who couldn't control his sexual urges because he couldn't stay faithful to you know, his wife. He was having an affair. Joey had a male role model, but it wasn't necessarily the best male role model, and Joey ended up becoming a womanizer. Now, the key to Joey, he's lovable because he doesn't mean to harm people. He's kind of clueless sometimes, and when he is sleeping with women and not calling them and stuff, it's not necessarily that he's doing it intentionally to hurt them. But again, he has a lot of the same porn usage issues as Chandler, so he's not really humanizing these women. These women are kind of like a means to, you know, sexual conquest, and that's very, very much a lack of sexual discipline, which shows a lot of wounded feminine, which you can find a lot in men that have not stepped into their masculine energy. Joey's also an actor. People who are in creative fields like that tend to be more connected with their feminine energy than to their masculine energy. But as much as Joey's passionate about acting, he's also very irresponsible when it comes to that. He's not really great at staying focused. He really has not stepped into any of his like masculine discipline and focus. One thing about Joey I will say is that, and this is for the sake of the show, and I again, some of these things probably would not translate into real life, but when the chips are down and his friends need him, Joey's there for them. It kind of reminds me a little bit, and this is on a much more like kind of like sitcom humor scale, but I remember hearing this, I mentioned this in a few videos, of a character breakdown of Han Solo from Star Wars, and the fact that he is a character who believes he's solely in his ego. He doesn't really have a deeper level. He's really just into the superficial and the shallow. And then he finds out that he actually does care about something deeper. And that person that believes that they're just an egomaniac but actually has something deeper to them is a very endearing character. Like, we're very drawn to characters like that. Now, the opposite is not true. Somebody who thinks that they're a deeper character and actually is in their ego, that's a whole different situation. That's really where you're gonna find a narcissist or sociopath. But somebody who thinks that they're in their ego and it's just very shallow, but actually has a deeper layer to them, we really connect with characters like that. We tend to really find those characters to be so relatable. And there's a lot of moments on the show where Joey is that guy. You know, Joey is the guy that, you know, thinks he's just kind of shallow and superficial, but actually does have a deeper level to him. I'm thinking of the scene where Rachel is afraid she's going into labor. She's pregnant and she's having a lot of pains and contractions. She's really scared, and Joey is like, okay, we're gonna get you to the hospital. We're gonna do this. Like, he jumps into action, and he's very like grounded. He's the masculine direction in that. Now, when they find out everything is okay, that's when he breaks down and is just sort of like, I was panicked. I was just trying to keep it together for you, which is the humor of the show. But the fact that he actually showed up and was able to have that masculine focus and direction when the time was needed. Is that realistic for somebody who is so irresponsible in the rest of their life to actually get their act together when it's necessary? Probably not that common, right? For the sake of the show, it's entertaining, but in real life, somebody who does not have the ability to connect to that sort of focus, discipline, direction, like grounded stability, is not going to be able to just all of a sudden have that when it's needed. You're going to need to be able to have access to that in most of your life. But on the show, Joey is like the kind of guy that presents himself as the guy that is totally irresponsible, but then when the chips are down, he steps up, which is actually ironic because Ross is the exact opposite, but I'll get to Ross in a minute. Now, Rachel is an interesting character in the sense that the show really is, especially in the very beginning, is kind of her coming of age story. Rachel has just left her wedding, which is sort of the direction that was chosen for her. She was following the direction that her mom had followed. She's following the direction that was just sort of set for her life of marrying a doctor. And she was going to marry a doctor, have a wealthy life, be taken care of, and then that was going to be her life. She decides that she just doesn't love him and that she wants something more with her life. So she escapes that life and ends up at Monica's apartment, ends up trying to figure out how to become an independent woman. There's a lot of stumbles along the way, but she eventually finds a career in fashion that she's very passionate about. Now Rachel's interesting because at some points she's very like strong, focused, decisive, career driven. At other points she's just very immature and self-centered, and I have a hard time believing that somebody who had really no work experience, had kind of been like a spoiled suburban princess, which, you know, no judgments, but that had been who she was, becomes a waitress for a while and isn't very good at it, and then kind of gets a job in fashion and all of a sudden works up the ranks to getting these amazing jobs and these amazing positions in these major fashion houses. I just find it really hard to believe that Rachel's history and Rachel's story would actually result in that. Now, I know for the sake of the show, they wanted her to succeed and they wanted her to grow and they wanted her to become a successful career woman. And obviously she wanted that because she made the decision that she didn't want that kind of like suburban life that was already laid out for her. But it just is kind of hard to believe. And the fact that she is very spoiled and that she, you know, always had daddy take care of her and do things for her, and then all of a sudden became an independent woman and was totally okay with being an independent woman. But yet it's also implied too, like there was a show where Phoebe basically said that Monica was high maintenance and controlling and Rachel was like low maintenance and a pushover, which is odd because that's not what somebody who had been sort of a spoiled brat and selfish and all about her, she would have been high maintenance as well and not so much of a pushover. Rachel's character, I feel like, was very inconsistent throughout the show, and as much as I think all the characters were not necessarily how things would play out in real life, Rachel's character, I feel like, was one of the biggest stretches for me as far as, I don't see how Rachel in the beginning of the show gets to be Rachel at the end of the show. And that's not to say that a woman can't make a decision that she doesn't want to go someplace with her life and make the decision to change, but she didn't seem to change as a person as much, but yet her life path changed so much. Like, however, when her and Ross get together and they have a relationship, and I'll get to Ross in a minute, but Ross becomes very needy in the relationship for a lot of reasons that I'll get into, but I do understand the fact that she really wanted to focus on her job and her career at that point because that was something that was new for her and it was something that was really important, and she'd never felt that. She'd never felt like she was doing anything for herself. And then when Ross wanted the relationship to be all about him, he needed the relationship to be about him specifically, but he wanted her to be focused solely on their relationship. That kind of is the deterioration of their relationship in the beginning because Rachel is so focused on passion and purpose, but she's never had that before, so it's something that's new for her. So that is an indication that she's really thrown herself into her career. Then there's a lot of implications throughout the show that she's not as focused on her career, but yet she still seems to end up moving up in her career and getting all these opportunities, which I guess kind of implies the idea that things are handed to her. Rachel's energy is a little bit more difficult to really pinpoint. Like, she was emotional sometimes, she was like laid back and chill and not in touch with her emotions other times. Sometimes she liked to be in control, sometimes she didn't. Being responsive to your environment is very feminine, so you could argue that Rachel had some feminine energy. She would get really excited about like meeting soap opera stars and stuff, like that giddiness. That stuff is very feminine. It is interesting too, like when Ross makes a comment about, you know, Rachel being like devoid of sentiment because she returns all of the gifts that she's given, and she shows him like the stuff that she's saved that has meaning. So like there's this kind of idea that she puts a lot of value in things that have an emotional connection. Things that she isn't as emotionally attached to, she kind of sees for the surface level. You know, she'll exchange a necklace that someone gets her, but like she'll save like a ticket stub from her first date with a man she's in love with, like that kind of thing. I think for the feminine to feel sentimental value to things that don't have a monetary value is something that's valid. One of the moments on Friends that just stays with me, and I feel like this moment, whew, I could get emotional even thinking about it, when Rachel's mom, played by the iconic Marlo Thomas, tells Rachel that she's going to divorce Rachel's dad, and Rachel gets really emotional and she's really frustrated, and the mom is really trying to confide in her. Now Rachel's mom is very much in her feminine. She's so much in her feminine flow and this and that, and she is like, you know, obviously been with a man. Rachel's dad is, when you meet him, is a really kind of like cruel, heartless type of man. He's a heart surgeon, which is kind of ironic, that, and he ends up having a heart attack. The fact that he's kind of a cruel, heartless man is, I think, symbolism there. But when Rachel's mom has decided she's gonna get a divorce, and she's just so much in her flow, and she's so feeling good about herself, and Rachel's going through this whole emotional reaction because, you know, her parents' relationship is falling apart and she's having a really difficult time with it. And, you know, her mom is basically just like, I thought, you know, if anyone, you could relate to this. And Rachel's like, why would I possibly relate to this? And she says something, ooh, this line just sits with me. She goes, you didn't marry your Barry, honey, but I married mine. Like, whew, if that is not a generational curse being broken. I know for me, like when I went through my divorce and I started realizing all of the patterns that I had repeated in my marriage, and that I had walked into a situation that was so much like my parents' relationship, and I realized that I didn't want that. I had to sit with the fact that my mother was still married to the person that I was trying to get away from. Like, not the same person, but the same issues. And I think that's something that, especially as women, but anybody really that's breaking a generational curse, it can be a really hard realization when you're breaking the generational curse, is realizing the people before you that haven't broken the generational curse and actually had to go through the pain that you have made the decision to avoid, but like they're still experiencing the pain. And there can be a lot of guilt associated with that. There can be a lot of complicated emotions that come with that. And I know, whew, that line, just, you know, you didn't marry your Barry, honey, but I married mine. Like wow. Like that line, that lives rent-free in my head and probably always will. I think it's really symbolic of the fact that, you know, Rachel was symbolic of an old idea of, you know, you marry the doctor, you marry the guy with money, and he takes care of you, and you have the suburban house, and it doesn't matter if you don't love him because you're just marrying him for the money, and you're just marrying him for the support, and you're not going to expect anything from him. You're not going to expect him to be a good man. You're not going to expect him to give you anything other than just monetary security. And I think that there are a lot of women today who are like, okay, I can't accept just that. I can't be with someone just for monetary security. I can't be with someone who's only going to show up and put a roof over my head, that isn't actually going to show up as a loving partner, that isn't also going to cherish me, that isn't also going to be willing to work on themselves, to be willing to work on our relationship. That's what women today are looking for. Now, if you want a man who is financially stable and can support you, I'm all for that. However, for most women, especially today, that's not going to be enough. And for Rachel, it wasn't going to be enough, and she knew that, and it's why she didn't marry Barry. However, her mother had been of the generation where she married for the support, because that's what you did. And she realized later on in life that she couldn't be with somebody who didn't care about her. And it's interesting, there's also a line when Rachel is kind of like back and forth between her parents at a party, and the mother is going, you know, it's like, you work on a marriage, and all he cares about is that boat. And then she goes to her dad, and her dad's like, you work and you work and you work on a boat. You know, it's Because again, her dad cared about making the money, and then he cared about his material things, and he cared about his hobbies, his stuff. And Rachel's mom wanted a relationship. She wanted a marriage. She was prioritizing the relationships, and she needed more than just somebody who was going to simply provide money and then go off and do his own thing and not care about her. She needed more than that. She needed more of an emotional connection. We can complain about modern times all we want, and believe me, I've got a lot of lists of things that I can complain about for modern times, but I think we need to be careful of when we put sort of the 1950s, 1960s idea of relationships up on a pedestal of, you know, the man going to work and providing and the woman staying home and taking care of the family. Like, those things are all great. Like, I'm not knocking those things, but it's not like all those relationships were totally healthy and stable, and it's not like the people in those relationships didn't feel like they were missing out on something, which I really do believe is the reason why feminism was able to come in and take women out of the homes and convince women that they should leave the homes, is because there were a lot of women who weren't happy. Now, is leaving their families and leaving their children and going off and working in the corporate world, is that the answer? For some women it might be, for a lot of women it probably wasn't, but at the end of the day there was something missing. Like, something like feminism cannot come in and lure women out of the homes and away from their families if at the root of it there wasn't something there that women were missing, if there wasn't something there that women needed, that they felt like they needed to go somewhere else to try to find. Did feminism do everything right? Has everything worked out the right way? Has the way we've gone in our society the right way to do things? That's totally up for debate. But the reality is, if everything was like so perfect in the 1950s and that whole dynamic was so perfect, it wouldn't have been able to be destroyed. Feminism or any kind of manipulation or corruption or, you know, conspiracy theory or anything would not have been able to step in and break that up, because it would have worked too well. So, you know, we have to acknowledge that things were not necessarily perfect in those time periods. Did it mean that we had to destroy everything and destroy the family and everything in order to, you know, fix it? I mean, we did it, so we can't really undo it, but, you know, where we go from here is a decision that we all have to make, I think, as individuals, but I think we also have to acknowledge that things were not perfect in the past. And Rachel really was going through a process of healing a generational curse. Did she do everything right? I mean, who knows, but she really was breaking a generational curse in her family, which is possibly one of the reasons why Rachel was kind of hard to figure out, because she was really just figuring herself out, which is one of the reasons why I think her character was, I think, the least consistent of all of them throughout the series. All right, let's get to Ross. Man, I can't stand Ross. Oh boy. Okay, Ross is a covert narcissist. The only credit that I can give to Ross and his character is that David Schwimmer does an amazing job of portraying this character, because you love to hate him. Like, you love to hate Ross because he is such a hateable character, but he is a covert narcissist. And again, he's clearly not someone who has grown up. Like, all of these guys are absolute man children. None of these guys have fully stepped into their masculine. In fact, that's probably one of the reasons why Richard stood out so much. I mean, partly because he was Tom Selleck, but also because he was so different, because he was so grounded and so masculine. But Ross is just so immature. I mean, he still calls his mom mommy, like he literally has not grown up. And why would he? Because he was so praised as a child. He was so put up on this pedestal as a child that, like, why would he want to grow up? Because his life as a child was so phenomenal, because he was put up on such a pedestal as a child, that why would he want to grow up? Which is really interesting, because if you want a little boy to grow up into a man, you have to give him challenges. You have to guide men into their masculinity. I've mentioned this in a ton of other videos, but in almost every culture in history, men have needed initiation processes to go from boys into manhood, to step into their masculine. Young boys do not automatically go into their masculine energy. They need to be initiated into their masculine energy. They need masculine leaders in order to guide them. Men are not innately masculine. They have to be taught to step into that. And in other cultures, initiation processes were pretty harsh. I mean, they were, you know, boys sent out in the woods, and if you could survive and find your way back, then you got to mate. If not, you were left for dead. You know, I'm not saying that we should do that in our society. However, the fact that in our society we don't have any initiation processes for boys to help them step into their masculine is a big problem we have today. And I think the characters on Friends are an absolute example of that. For women, nature initiates us into our feminine energy. And in reality, for most women, we have to break through all the blockages of the things that come up in society that are trying to tear us away from our feminine energy. But our feminine energy is natural, it's within us. Nature initiates us into womanhood. You know, for women, it's really more about connecting to our true selves, whereas for the masculine, their job is to be initiated into the masculine by the elders in their society. Ross is a prime example of somebody who has not grown up. It's ironic, and this is another thing that I think, like a real life Ross, because he has so much passion and purpose, he's so passionate about paleontology. It's something that's really important to him. You would think that he would have more masculine energy. You'd think he would be more grounded. He has a very stable career. I mean, he has some instability issues with the museum where he's working, and then he ends up becoming a professor. Other than that shaky area in the middle where he doesn't have a job and he's kind of going through some emotional stuff, for the most part, he has a passion and purpose. He has something that he's really passionate about. That is a big step in stepping into your masculine. So in reality, you wouldn't typically find someone that has that kind of passion, purpose, and direction in their career life to be so childlike in their personal life. You would normally see someone who has the passion and purpose and direction that Ross has in his professional life. You would usually see them as a more grounded, stable person in their personal life. Whereas somebody who, you know, didn't have that passion and purpose and direction would have a lot more instability in their personal life for a masculine core being. So generally speaking, normally somebody with Ross's sort of personality and personal life, you would expect him to have more of a job like Chandler, where he was just showing up and going through the motions. So the fact that Ross had this passion and purpose in his career, it does seem odd that he would be the way he was in his personal life. Ross was your typical guy who fell in love too quickly. He love bombed for sure. I think he was so much in his wounded feminine. Which is odd because, like, he always criticized Monica for, you know, being overweight and stuff when she was younger. She was doing that from her wounded feminine, but Ross's wounded feminine was to just fall in love way too quickly and just jump into relationships and become absolutely obsessed with being in a relationship. He did that with Rachel, he did that with Emily. He, you know, he would constantly get into these relationships and then just become obsessed with the relationship. So in his relationships, he was very much the feminine, but very wounded feminine of being very needy. He gets involved with Rachel, who he's been in love with from afar forever. He's so, like, obsessed with her, and she's got her career, and, you know, he was so needy. Like, he needed to be around her all the time. He didn't want her to have outside friendships. He didn't want her to be focused on career because, you know, their anniversary had to take priority. Like, he needed everything to be about him. Again, that's where I believe that there's some covert narcissism, because in reality, he was focused on his career. So if something had to happen and his career had to be a priority, she would have been expected to understand that. And somebody like Rachel probably would have. However, he couldn't handle her having a career and her having something she was passionate about that didn't have something to do with him. He had planned out their whole life together. He'd planned out, you know, when they were gonna have kids and where their kids were gonna go to school and where they were gonna buy a house. And Rachel had just left a marriage. She just left Barry. She just left a life that had been so planned out for her and was trying to find herself, and Ross started putting all this pressure on her that these things had to happen and they had to happen right away. Eventually that deteriorated the relationship. His jealousy of somebody who really wasn't trying to get with Rachel, of somebody who, you know, was just helping Rachel career-wise, but Ross had this insane jealousy that just really overtook him. His, like, obsessive need for more, that's very much the feminine, but when it becomes that obsession, it very much is tapped into a very wounded feminine. His obsessive need to kind of control around him, though, it's actually very similar to Monica's obsessive need. Both Monica and Ross, being siblings, it's interesting how they both have so much wounded feminine and so much wounded masculine and a lot of instability. It's expressed differently. In Monica, it's an obsessive need for cleanliness. In Ross, it's an obsessive need to control everything in his relationships. In Monica, her wounded feminine was her overeating. In Ross, his wounded feminine was his like constant neediness in a relationship. Like they both had this massive instability. Now the difference with Monica is that Monica seemed to be somebody who showed up and what you see is what you get, right? With Ross, he was really showing up in relationships or showing up in the world trying to present himself in a certain way. The veil would fall and he would be a different way, which is very typical in things like covert narcissism. He also, even though, I mean, his porn usage wasn't as mentioned as much as Joey and Chandler, he very much objectified women. Very much objectified women. And while he would fall deeply in love with Rachel, he fell really hard for Emily, like he would fall in love with women, he would also objectify women drastically. And in fact, later on in the show, it was literally all about like him getting a date because he needed sex. Like, I need to get the date because I needed sex. And it's like, the fact that he thought that just going on a date with a woman was going to get him sex and that he needed it, and it was so selfish. It was so all about him. It was so all about like, well, I need this, so I need to do this. And of course, that obsessive neediness for something, whether it be the obsessive neediness for a relationship like what he had with Rachel, or his obsessive neediness to get sex from a woman on a date, usually left him with nothing because that neediness was repelling people. Neediness is very repelling for just about anybody. And I know there's this whole idea of like, oh, men need to be needed. Men need to be desired, men need to be wanted. They want to feel like they have a place in your life. But a person that needs you to be needy is usually a sign of a predator, or a sign of somebody who's so insecure that they need someone who is desperately dependent on them. In reality, like a healthy masculine man is going to love that you desire a relationship with him, and he's gonna love that you desire him in that way. But like a neediness, that like grasping neediness, which neediness tends to be very closed. It tends to be very closed-hearted. Desire has a more open feeling, if you think about it like that. So people in relationships want to be desired, but when that neediness comes in, usually people get repelled. Male or female, you're probably going to get repelled because the masculine desires freedom. If he's with a needy person, it's going to constrict his freedom, right? And don't get too caught up in like freedom of like he needs to like fool around with a bunch of people. It's more of like it's a conscious freedom. It's a different kind of, it's not like a childish, irresponsible freedom. It's more like a freedom of constraints. It's more of a conscious thing. I don't want to get too deep into this right now. Like a needy feminine person is going to feel constricting to a masculine partner. A feminine who desires a relationship with a masculine is going to feel much more aligned for him. If you're a feminine woman and you're in a relationship with somebody who's very needy, you're going to feel his feminine energy and you're likely going to have to put up your masculine because a needy man is going to feel very unstable for you. So neediness in general is kind of a turnoff. Desire for a partner, desire for a person is different. It's a different feeling, and that's much more of a turn on. Ross's neediness, whether it be needing to be in a relationship or needing sex from a woman or something like that, is a big turn off for most people. I also notice that Ross sabotages relationships with women who actually are into him. Very classically sabotages those. Julie was a very stable, grounded person. He cared about her very much, but he sabotaged that relationship to be with Rachel. Rachel, who had that drama. Ross likes the drama. He likes the drama, the complications. It's interesting how in his first relationship with Carol, who he had a pretty good relationship with her as a co-parent with their son Ben, but the fact that Ross is so unstable and not mature, and he ended up marrying a woman who was a lesbian and ended up in a lesbian relationship, you can kind of see where oftentimes Carol felt like she had to kind of mother Ross. And she did in some cases throughout the series in like friendship interactions that they had. Carol had a more mothering energy towards Ross than a romantic relationship, which gives you a little bit of a glimpse into what their relationship was probably like before they got divorced and Carol basically realized that she wanted to be in a relationship with a woman. His obsession with Rachel. He leaves Julie. Julie's very calm and stable. I would say Julie had a little bit more of a grounded masculine energy, which is probably why they attracted, because Ross has more instability. So that relationship probably wasn't necessarily going to last. Julie was into him, she was there, she was into the relationship, and he ends up going for Rachel because Rachel's chaotic, right? And Ross loves the drama. A lot of men like to claim that they don't like the drama. They want the peace and the calm, but they will dump the woman who's peace and calm, and they will go for the drama all the time, because in order to have sexual polarity in a relationship, you need passion, and in order to have heat, you need friction. So Ross is drawn to Rachel because Rachel is more chaotic. There's more drama there. Now, I'm not saying you should go for the dramatic relationship or that you should be a drama queen or anything like that, but calm, stable, cool, like being a man's peace is probably going to kill the sexual attraction. And men might have sex with a woman who is bringing them peace and calm, but he's probably just going to be having sex with her as a way to release his sexual tension, but there's not going to be that passion there. And Ross and Rachel had more passion because there was more instability. Now, I'm not saying they had a healthy relationship by any means, but the instability of that relationship was what kind of caused the friction, which is what brought on some of the polarity. Now, Ross is very unstable. Rachel was going to have to be more stable in that relationship, and I'm not saying it was going to be a healthy polarity, but that was what was going to cause more polarity because there was more friction there. He ends up with Emily. Emily's relationship was a little odd, but he like jumped into that relationship, totally love bombed her. And it was interesting because they were gung-ho about the relationship, and then the minute that she was kind of like, I don't know, like, you know, things were getting complicated with their wedding, and he was like, no, this is what's going to happen, and he got very controlling on her. He flips very much from being this very kind of like needy, weak, anything you want dear kind of thing, to being aggressively controlling really quickly. Like, that instability is going to make anybody feel uneasy. Then, of course, he iconically says Rachel's name at the wedding. I know Emily probably panicked, and it was partly for the show, but I think generally speaking, like going forward with the wedding and the wedding ceremony and, you know, signing all the papers and everything like that, probably wasn't the smartest idea, but it was for the show. Now, Emily becomes super controlling, and Ross ends up becoming not able to handle that, and that relationship dissolves. Now, of course, when Ross is dating Mona, now Mona is somebody that the show really, I think, gave him to give him like kind of the perfect woman. She was gorgeous, she was into him, and he had to screw that up. And it's interesting how Mona was so perfect for him. She laughed at his jokes. She was interested in the stuff that he would talk about. Again, she was attractive. You know, she had everything that Ross always said he wanted. But Ross kept forgetting about her. He kept focusing his energy on Rachel. Of course, at that point, he found out Rachel was pregnant with his baby. And Mona was even willing to go along with a lot of that. And she was even willing to be open-minded to it to a point. And Ross kept screwing it up. Because Ross is famous for, if he gets a good situation, he has to screw it up. Consistently screws up things with Rachel, and, you know, they have a baby together. Ross is the kind of guy that you want to look out for. Ross is the kind of guy who will love bomb you. He's the kind of guy that will gaslight you. He'll be so needy, and he'll be Mr. Sensitivity, and then he'll flip and become really controlling. Guys like Ross are a huge red flag. They're dangerous. And it's all fun and games for the show, like it's funny, it's entertaining, but like in real life, guys like Ross are really dangerous. They're the kind of guys that are like, oh, I'm the good guy. That's where I get the covert narcissism. Covert narcissism, or they also call it vulnerable narcissism, tend to be people who are narcissists, but they're not the grandiose ones who are like, you know, show off, I'm so great, which Ross has some of, but it usually is people who are very manipulative with their sensitivity, with their vulnerability. They use that stuff, like they're not actually sensitive and vulnerable with people, but they use the presentation of being vulnerable and the presentation of being like the good guy as a way to manipulate you into getting what they want from you, as opposed to actually being open and sensitive and vulnerable in order to have a relationship with. How can you tell if you're dealing with somebody like a Ross, or if you're dealing with somebody who actually is willing to show up in a relationship with you as a vulnerable person in intimacy? Only time will tell. Because somebody like Ross can't hold up that persona forever. So that's why it's really important as women to take a relationship slow. When you get somebody who rushes into a relationship, because when you get someone who's like really excited about a relationship, I've done that before plenty of times. You get somebody who's really excited about the relationship and you think, oh, they're excited about it, you get excited about it, and you rush into something really way too quickly, and then you end up with everything falling apart around you. It's really important as a woman to pace the relationship, to not jump in too much. And if you have a guy who's constantly pushing the relationship to go quicker, you might be dealing with somebody who's just knows what he wants and knows his direction and his focus. However, you also might be dealing with somebody who is trying to rush you into something for their own selfish needs. And that's why it's really important to pace the relationship, to take things slow, to pay attention, to observe someone's actions, make sure their words and their actions align, and actually look for patterns. So important for women to start looking for red flags in relationships, because ignoring red flags is what gets you in a dangerous relationship. And in real life, a relationship with someone like Ross is very dangerous. It really is. Like it's a recipe for somebody who is selfish, who is gonna start drama in the relationship just to get that heat and friction, because he can't get that from like a natural polarity. It's someone who's gonna love bomb you, be really needy, but then also be very controlling. It's a really, really dangerous situation to be in, and that's why as women I want you to be aware of the red flags so that you can learn to pace the relationship so that you don't end up in a toxic relationship like that. I've saved the best for last. Well, at least my favorite character anyway, and that is Phoebe. Oh, Phoebe is such a feminine character. I love Phoebe so much. I love that she is, as much as she is kind of like all over the place and kind of like, they call her flaky at one point, she's a little flighty, she always ends up kind of saving the day and having the right answer. And I just love that. Phoebe is so in touch with her feminine energy. Now, in reality, Phoebe has grown up in a very rough situation. She's a twin sister she doesn't have anything to do with. She lost her mother at a young age to suicide. Her stepfather's in prison. Her dad had abandoned her. She ends up finding a half-brother that she's never met before. Phoebe has had a really rough life, growing up on the streets, and I have to admit, I find it really hard to believe that somebody with Phoebe's backstory would be as wise and stable and just loving and grounded as she is. And I know that there's a lot of moments where kind of the sort of street Phoebe comes out, so to speak. But in reality, somebody like Phoebe would have a very difficult time becoming like such a healthy adult. And there's moments on the show where Phoebe isn't. I think there's a lot of moments on the show where Phoebe, it kind of implies that, you know, you have to have sex with a man in order for him to like you, or moments that I think it's kind of implied that Phoebe jumps to sex too quickly. Some of it's said in kind of a joking kind of way. That is absolutely not healthy feminine energy. That's very wounded feminine energy. Having sex with somebody so that they'll like you, not valuing your sexuality and things like that. I'm not saying that that's a consistent thing with Phoebe, but there have been a few jokes and implications throughout the series that Phoebe is like that. So that part is not feminine. The fact that Phoebe is, she's very connected to nature. She's very connected to, I would say, spirituality, other realms. You know, I know she's kind of painted as being kind of like out there, but she's just so connected to her feminine. She plays guitar and she sings. Is she great at it? No. Does she enjoy it? Yes. Oh my God, the show where she runs, like her and Rachel are gonna go on a run and Rachel's kind of like running like really serious and Phoebe's like running all crazy is so amazing. Like Phoebe says, like, I run like I'm a kid being chased by the neighbor dog because like that's when it was fun. That's when running was fun. Like Phoebe is all about doing things that like feel good, that feel good in her body, that feel good in her soul. She's not really worried about what other people think of her. She doesn't care as much what other people think of her. She's a massage therapist, so she really loves like helping people and being there for people. She's so loving to her friends. She cares about, you know, her relationships, her connections. She's just such a loving, wonderful person. She also has a dark side. She's not afraid to call out a friend if they're doing something wrong. She's not afraid to stand up for what she believes in. She's not afraid to shoot someone down. She's got a really great connection to her dark feminine as well. For somebody who is so like sort of earthy and mystical, which is very much her light feminine, where she's very much in flow, she's into sensations, she's having fun, she will stand up for herself. She will absolutely call someone out if she wants to. like that dark feminine is so great when it comes out in her, you know what I mean? Like I love Phoebe's connection to her overall feminine energy. And it's actually interesting too when like Ross gets so obsessed with trying to prove to Phoebe that like evolution is a proven fact. Like there's the scene where Phoebe is basically like, are you trying to tell me that you believe that that is the only possible thing? And she really calls him out. Like that's feminine testing at its best. If you see that scene where she's basically talking to Ross about like evolution and things like that and like calling him out, and he's just like, I suppose there's a possibility that I'm wrong. And she's like, wow, I can't believe you caved. Like, I mean, I may not have agreed with you, but at least I respected you. Like that is so feminine testing. Like I love that because she knew that Ross was unstable. He was so closed-minded and like narrow-minded. Phoebe basically was like testing him to see if he could waver. And then when he kind of wavered a little bit, not because he wanted to, but because he kind of felt like he had to, she was like, wow, like it looks like he gave in. Like that's such a beautiful example of feminine testing. I have other videos about feminine testing, but Phoebe's really great for that. She's not afraid to call someone out. She's not afraid to challenge someone. Like she's such a beautiful feminine character. I just love Phoebe so much. She's also very comfortable with her sexuality. I know especially later on in the series when she is with Mike and she partners with him, and there's always like these like implications of like her being into like really dirty stuff and all this kind of stuff, and it's like she's very comfortable with her feminine sexuality. She's got a lot of like dark sexual fantasies, which is part of her dark feminine energy. Yeah, like Phoebe is just such an amazing character. I love that there's a character on a TV show that is so connected to her feminine energy, because it's not that common. It's not that common in sitcoms to find a character who is so deeply connected to her feminine in like a true way, like connected to open-hearted feminine and light feminine as well as dark feminine, and not have it feel very masculine. You know what I mean? Like I feel like oftentimes we think of somebody like a Monica because she wants to have marriage and kids and those traditional things. We think of that as being the definition of being feminine. But in reality, somebody like Phoebe, who actually has such an open heart, she's so much in flow, she's into sensuality, she's very responsive to her environment. Those kind of things are what really makes someone feminine. And it's not to say that Monica couldn't connect to her feminine and that wanting marriage and kids and wanting those traditional things, there's nothing wrong with that, but that doesn't by definition make you feminine. And Phoebe does realize that she does want those things, but she also realizes that, like later on in the show, she wants those things not just to fulfill her, but she wants those things because it's a deep desire within her, not just because it's checking something off on her list. You know, she wants those things because it's something that she actually feels called to do, as opposed to something that's like, okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is get married, and the next thing I'm going to do is have a family and this and that. It's not a checklist thing, it's something that's a calling from her soul. She has an on again, off again relationship with David, who's a scientist. It's entertaining, but I don't really think her relationship with David was really gonna work because he's so unsure of himself. In fact, Phoebe dates Monica's like assistant chef at one point, and Phoebe's like, oh my god, he's so needy, he's constantly checking on me all the time. And I think she even says at one point, like, come on, be a man, like that kind of thing. It's not that a guy being a good guy or a guy being interested in a woman or something is inherently wrong. It's just, again, that neediness, that like constant, like not being able to be focused on your career and not being able to have something that exists outside of the relationship. It's gonna feel more like the feminine in the relationship, and somebody who's as feminine as Phoebe is gonna need a man who can step into his masculine. So like a guy that's showing too much neediness or too much instability is not gonna work. Now, I think the reason why things work with Phoebe and Mike, the guy she ends up marrying, Mike is more stable, he's more grounded. I still think, I mean, I know why they kind of presented him as somebody who, you know, was a lawyer who'd given everything up to be a piano player, and I know that they thought that was a good match for Phoebe. They both value things like charity. They're both very anti-materialistic stuff. I do feel like Mike doesn't feel as grounded and stable a person as I would think that Phoebe would need, like in real life. But he is a good guy, and he does love Phoebe for all of her feminine chaos, for all of her dark and her light. So, I mean, that's really what the feminine needs. The feminine needs someone who's gonna love her through all of that stuff, all of her flavors, all of her moods, all of her emotions, all of her feelings, who's going to be willing to stand grounded and rooted when she's testing him. They present Mike as somebody who truly loves her through that. Now, in real life, kind of feel like Phoebe would need someone who's a little bit more stronger and more grounded. But I kind of get why they wrote Mike in the way that they did. But yeah, I love Phoebe so much in this show. I always have, like, I've always really loved Phoebe so much, but I didn't have as much of an appreciation for her until I started studying feminine energy and started realizing like how beautiful her feminine energy is in its dark and in its light. So she's totally my favorite character. I would love to know what your thoughts are on some of these characters. I know this video is probably really long. This was such an iconic show and was on for 10 seasons. I wish I could do some scene breakdowns, but copyright stuff is just a problem right now. If I can figure that out, I might do some scene breakdowns down the road. But yeah, I would love to know what you guys think of the show and the different characters, which characters you relate to, which of the energies that you see in each of the characters. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a big thumbs up and be sure you subscribe to my channel. I highly encourage you to watch the show if you haven't already and see if you can pick up on some of the things that I talked about. I have a new book, the Dark Feminine Energy Guided Journal, if you want to connect your dark feminine energy and be like Phoebe. Details in the description box below, along with links to all my social media accounts, including my new TikTok if you want to follow me there. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you join me next time.